A warm welcome to Voice of Russia's political program, Debating Russia. I'm your moderator, Peter Lavelle. Where does Russia's relations with the West stand today? What is the condition of the so-called reset with Washington? And importantly, are we witnessing the rise of a new type of Cold War? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by my guests in London, Jonathan Steele of The Guardian, James Thakkara, he's an epic writer specializing in human rights issues, and here in Voice of Russia's Moscow studio with me is Dmitry Suslov. He's the Deputy Director of the Center for Comprehensive European and International Studies. Okay, Jonathan, if I can go to you first. Let's talk about the reset. Is the reset still working? Did it ever work? Is there hope that it could work?
Well, I think it did work at the beginning when there was an arms control agreement, but since then it's really gone into cold storage. And the Syrian issue has really exposed a major split, with the United States attacking Russia constantly for supporting the Assad regime when they should have been working with them. Now, finally, they have begun to work with them, but they wasted a year in this rather Cold War thing of lining up against Russia.
Jonathan, you said arms control agreement. I'm glad you mentioned that because I think a lot of people have forgotten it. Do you need to have a reset in relations to have an agreement on arms control? It's mutually beneficial for both countries in the world. Do we have to have a new era in relations to have an arms control agreement? Is this how bad it is?
Well, I don't think we should talk in terms of new era in international relations. I mean, I think the relationships are normal. You know, countries have their different interests and their different allies and friends, and on certain issues they have to make agreements, and that's what's happened. On some issues, Russia and America agree, on some they disagree. That should be normal. So I don't think we should be expecting suddenly to have a sort of buddy-buddy new era. No, just accept that it's normal, but that also means talking in normal language and not insulting other countries. And I'm afraid some of the language from Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State on the issue of Syria and so on was really quite provocative and insulting in what she said about Russia.
Okay, James, if we can stay with the theme of Hillary Clinton, she did say that Russia was rebuilding the Soviet Union in the last few months of her time at the State Department. How do you see relations between the two countries and maybe Russia's relationship with the West in general?
We haven't mentioned the word Cold War, the phrase. The Cold War was constituted by the strategic balances and by unjustifiable institutions of paranoia. That has been added to since then by the web. So I would say that just statistically and in terms of sheer bulk of surveillance, animosity, mistrust, the Cold War has in fact been enhanced. I think Hillary's comments are rather irrelevant. She's very insulting, I agree. Jonathan hasn't said anything I disagree with. The business of the web is a huge added factor in all of this, and I should mention that I've notified Julian Assange that this program is being broadcast, and I assume he's either listening or will be listening.
The NSA already, sure, the NSA is listening to us now, okay.
They certainly are, yes. I mean, this question of listening or not listening, I mean, we have the First Amendment, which is freedom of speech. We have the Fourth Amendment, which is freedom of privacy, rather, right to privacy. The web is way out in a place where there are no laws, and the spectacle of America has been rather shaming over the last few days, intimidating governments, chasing Evo Morales, the first indigenous president of a Latin American country in a long time. All of this actually confirms how aggressive the security state has become in America. I don't want to be criticizing my country in this, but a lot of the heat in America about this issue and what's going on in your airport right now derives from the perception that the security state in America, which now numbers 1.2 million top security cleared people, it has been augmenting itself since the beginning of the Bush regime. I don't think it's that America wants to rule the world, though we are present in 120 countries now. But it's certainly gotten out of hand, and I think the Russians have considerable right to be concerned about this. But one would hearken back to the Soviet period and say that this security state problem we've got goes back to the 30s in Russia and to the War Powers Act in America in 41. We've all been accumulating security states. And after Glasnost, I had a conversation with Mike Scammell in which I said I was rather concerned that the security apparatus in Russia would persist. And he said that would never happen. And after what the Russians have been through, they would dismantle the whole thing. But in fact, you've been building command control centers in the Urals on American money. And I think both these countries need to be talking to each other in a much more friendly way, because this problem that we've got with security states is a Russian problem, an American problem, and we have to solve that together. And I think we should include China in that. China is part of this problem, and our governments are failing us. The peoples of Russia, China, and America are being failed. failed, and I think capitalism is letting all these three countries down too.
You've covered a lot of space there, okay? If I could go to Dima here. The issue of language was brought up here, and this kind of condescending attitude all the time. A couple of weeks ago on this program, we did Syria, and one of my guests said, if Putin just did the right thing and agreed with the Americans. But that's still that condescending attitude, that the U.S. is right, its interests are better, more honorable than anyone else's, and everyone has to agree.
Sure, this is one of the fundamental problems in the Russia-Western relations, that the West expects Russia to follow the Western pattern in its domestic and foreign policy and agree with the universality of not just Western values, which perhaps are universal, but with the Western reading of interests, which is definitely not universal. But coming back to the general state of the Russia-US and Russia-Western relations, I am cautiously optimistic right now. Why? Because despite all the growing number of contradictions, Syria, nuclear arms, missile defense, and stuff like that, the relations are not deteriorating. The sides are still committed to continuing normal relations. I think the relations have acquired a pattern of pragmatic, selective cooperation, and I totally agree with one of the guests in London that it is absolutely normal thing that we agree on something and disagree on the other thing, and this is a state of normality in the US-Russia relations, and our disagreements and contradictions should not bury the relations and should not bury cooperation on the things that we agree. This is why failing to agree on Syria, failing to agree on nukes and on missile defense, we have established a new working group of the Bilateral Presidential Commission. We have established new formats of relations on the level of Vice President and Russian Prime Minister, the group of four, and so on and so forth. But
Dmitry, if I can go to Jonathan,
yeah.
I agree with everything you said. I think it was said very well. But Jonathan, the issue of Mr. Snowden, okay, it gets down to Obama says, give him up, tells Vladimir Putin, give him up, or the reset is, I'm paraphrasing, I'm not quoting him, but you're putting the reset at stake here. But at the same time, Russia is fulfilling its legal obligations, and I don't want to waste too much time on this program and reiterating them. But again, there's a law and there's a bilateral agreement, but then when something happens, just give it up. I don't care what your law says. I don't care about extradition. Just give it him. And this is this kind of, again, this attitude of condescension towards Russia when it comes from its relationship with the West.
Well, it's more than condescension. It's bullying as well, isn't it? And I think President Putin was absolutely right to say that Snowden is a free person. He can leave when he wants to, as long as he's got international documents, which he doesn't at the moment have. But Russia's not going to give him up to the United States. And he said Russia never gives anybody up. So it's not as though they're making an exception here for Snowden. It's just normal. Again, that is the normal position of Russia. It doesn't give up people just like that.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia from the heart of London. On weekdays, we broadcast live from 4 p.m. until 8. We'll bring you news, current affairs, features and debate. You can listen to us on digital radio and online. Visit ruvr.co.uk.
You're listening to Voice of Russia's political program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. James, if I can go to you, let's reflect upon what Jonathan said. How can you have a good bilateral relationship with differences, as Dima pointed out here, when there's that element of bullying there? And it plays very well into Western media and perceptions and misperceptions about Russia.
Yeah, and actually there was a comment you made about Obama here, and I'd like to, without being a sort of whistleblower, or rather a cheerleader for Obama, I would say to you, Gary Will's comment right at the beginning of the Obama campaign, or Obama presidency actually, saying that if he had 36 years in office, he couldn't dismember this security apparatus. Obama's a constitutional lawyer, and I don't think when you say that it's Obama bullying people, Obama's trying to get us out of the biggest mistakes that have ever been made in history, those two invasions, which are cataclysmic in their outcome. And in fact, Russia's dealing with this issue at the moment with Syria. And I think Obama's backing out of that situation progressively by stages. The drones, he's taken it away from the CIA. I think America's bullying is something which is coming from a very large cartel of the old situation that we had in the States, the Republicans before him, some of the Democrats also, it has to be said. Some of the suspicion, though, it's a little unfair to say they were only bullying, because there's some bullying going on in Russia as well. And as somebody who was involved with Samizdat during the Sakharov period, I would think that a premier as powerful and authoritative as Volodymyr Putin doesn't really need to sort of confiscate documents at Memorial and do things like that, which kind of suggest that Russia isn't entirely comfortable with being democratic. Russia's in a very good position, as you were saying, to appear very democratic. I think they behave very well with Snowden. Snowden is actually in trouble not because of anything Putin said, but because he continues to want to divulge secrets, and Putin said he mustn't do this. I mean, I can understand Snowden's position as well as Putin's, actually.
James, you bring up a very good point, and I'll use the phrase that hasn't been brought up here yet, but the values gap.
Sure.
Dima, address that issue here, because I think we could look at the main newspapers, minus Jonathan's Guardian articles, okay, but look at everybody else writing about Russia. The assault on Russian society. I mean, just Google that, okay? Mm-hmm. Is there an assault on Russian society?
I'm quite critical with the state of the Russian domestic affairs and with the policies being conducted by President Putin. But the good thing is that they are a minor factor today in the US-Russia relations. Again, taking the recent summit in Northern Ireland, the Russian domestic politics, the issues of values and democracy has not been mentioned at all by the Obama administration. It was just absent, which means that
there was a lot on the plate. It was called Syria.
Yes, but not the Russian domestic politics, which means that the new kind of rules of the game that have been offered quite aggressively by Moscow in the year 2012, which are do not interfere into Russian domestic affairs and just treat us as we are and not as you wish us to be, are largely taken by the Obama administration.
So you're saying the United States isn't just being magnanimous because everyone knows that President Putin and anyone else could say, well, what about the NSA and the spying on American citizens?
The current situation is not favorable for the United States, absolutely, and Russia can appear even... I agree with the speakers in London, the Russian treatment of Mr. Snowden is very remarkable and just normal, whereas the US is in the middle of one of the greatest scandals, I think, in the history of American foreign policy, because spying the closest allies.
Peter, can I
Please do.
just slightly reset this conversation slightly and go back to the time after Glasnost when Anthony Lake and the shameful, I went to Harvard myself, so I'm rather ashamed at the financial way the business of democratization was handled. If you lived through the Samizdat period, and Jonathan will remember this well, the disappointment of Russian dissidents coming to the West. The West has never taken much time to actually understand Russian culture. It's very remarkably few people I meet in America who really are deeply involved with Russia. And I think a lot of the problem at the moment is that America tends to react to whoever their adversaries are. So if China is hacking them and looks as if it's going to once again become the number one economic power in the world, and Russia seeming friendly, then Russia gets beaten up and China is taken with tremendous seriousness. So, I mean, I think Putin he's quite justified up to a point in saying, hey, you're not respecting us, so we're going to be a little bit tougher with you. I don't feel there's any huge animosity between these two countries. There's a most incredible amount of ignorance, actually. And I hope, I would hope that Vladimir Putin will allow Snowden to stay there and go on divulging secrets, actually, because by saying that Snowden can't divulge secrets, he's actually acting for the American government. I don't think he wants to be doing that.
That's exactly why he wants to leave, because I think the perception would be, and we've already heard it in Western media, that he's a traitor, he's a defector, which is not the case. He wasn't invited to Russia. He wasn't invited to leak secret information, though I'd like to point out that people can come to Russia and leak secrets if they want. It's not against Russian law to leak American secrets here.
This is a very tough dilemma now that Russia faces, because if it grants political asylum to Snowden, keeping in mind that he will continue to produce those leaks, Russia can put the future US-Russia summit in early September in Moscow under question, because it will be quite unlikely that Obama could come.
Glenn Greenwald said that there are no more leaks to be leaked, okay? Whatever information is left out there are with news media and newspapers around the world. He didn't disclose who. Essentially, Snowden has given up what he's given up, okay? And I think that strategically played into Mr. Putin's hands, because he says, don't do it anymore. He probably won't. James, you wanted to jump in. Go ahead.
Well, yes, about this business of the web, because we've been talking for a number of decades now about the strategic balances and the institutions of paranoia, but this business of the web is actually a very interesting one. I don't think that, Julian and Snowden, we don't have to worry about whether they're saints or devils or whatever they are. They're, in fact, the canaries in an area where there's no law. And every country in the world ought to be defending them, not worrying whether they have yellow plumage and they're vegetarians. I mean, there's an awful lot of examination of their characters and insult going on back and forth. I think Russia should be defending Snowden. America should be defending Snowden. These people are doing a tremendous service to the planet, because we have to deal with the question of how we legitimize the information world that we live in. And I mean, that's actually an enormous issue that Putin could weigh in on, be very, very progressive and imaginative.
No, I mean, this is absolutely right, if I can also butt in. I mean, we had in our paper today a former environmental minister from Germany, Jürgen Trittin, saying that Germany should actually give asylum to Snowden because he has performed such an incredible service to mankind in alerting people to these huge tentacles of the security state.
Jonathan, Putin has made it very clear what Russia's position is, and I think he, in agreeing with Dima here with me, is that he's thinking about the bilateral relationship with the United States and Russia's relationship with the West. In a very odd way, counterintuitive way, this scandal, if we can put it that way, has actually made the two countries, the Americans and the Russians, actually sit down and talk to each other much more carefully.
We haven't even mentioned the word Afghanistan. I mean, the amount of cooperation between Russia and the United States on Afghanistan is quite extraordinary. If you talk to Russian diplomats, as I've done, they're actually more worried about the Americans leaving Afghanistan than the Americans are worried. They would rather the Americans stayed there because they really are afraid of the Taliban taking over and that extending Islamic fundamentalism to the Central Asian republics and then perhaps onto Russia itself. So they are really worried. And that's why they've allowed this incredible thing of allowing military flights to go over Russia that take American troops and materiel and weaponry and so on to Afghanistan. And now they're going to be helping them to come out. I mean, that is almost never mentioned in the US media, this amazing
Thank you, Jonathan,
the
for saying
generosity
that.
of Russia,
Because
if you like, but although it's, of course, self-interest, because, as I say, they're also very concerned about the future of Afghanistan.
About Obama again, the fact that we have not invaded Syria, I mean, we have now learned the Saddam Hussein paradigm, if you like, which is you remove this guy, things get worse. I mean, Iraq is in visibly worse condition than it was. So we have the position with Assad. And, if people are getting angry in Russia about Obama, I would have thought that Obama pretty well single-handedly is keeping us out of there, because he's no idiot. He knows perfectly well. When he made his Cairo speech, he was expecting not to get Ahmadinejad in Iran, and we were going to reset with the Arab world. Well, now that's impossible, and I don't think Obama wants to go wading into Syria, causing a lot of trouble, and I don't think he's in any disagreement, actually, though he couldn't possibly say that publicly, with what the Russians are doing.
Obama is himself a victim of this bullying. You have a president whose instincts are to keep out of Syria, as James has just pointed out, but he comes under tremendous bullying from elements of the security state, also obviously in Congress and in the media, to go in and, quotes, do something, although they don't really know what they actually want to do, and they certainly got no real strategy or an exit plan.
I don't want to keep singing the praises of Obama on this program. Dima, if I can go to you, it was mentioned earlier, which I think is very, very, very smart, is that, when you look at Afghanistan, and maybe in a very odd way, Russia is doing the Americans a favor in Syria, showing how dangerous going in there is going to be. But you never hear in mainstream media the good things about the bilateral relationship. Almost never. I mean, Afghanistan, Russia's concerns are really low. I mean, the back page of any page.
Well, the problem is that, first of all, media prefers negative news than positive news. Second problem is that we do not have domestic constituencies in either Russia or the United States who actually are interested and committed to positive relations. But indeed, I agree with you that below the radar, there are multiple good things, cooperative things that are done. And Afghanistan is obviously up the radar, not below the radar, because today Afghanistan is the major pillar of positive agenda in the US-Russia relations. But I won't be too optimistic here, and I'm quite concerned about the future of US-Russia cooperation about Afghanistan. Why? Because the closer we come to the date 2014, when the majority of American and international troops are scheduled to leave, the less cooperation we have. The problem is that Russia and the United States are fundamentally disagreeing on every angle of policy towards Afghanistan and Central Asia after 2014. They disagree about how to secure security in Afghanistan. They disagree about economic development of Afghanistan and how to do it. And they disagree about how to fight drug traffic. This is why, after 2014, if we do not elaborate immediately now real future-oriented dialogue on Afghanistan, it can, from the pillar of cooperation, turn into a pillar of contradiction, and more so into a source of geopolitical rivalry between Russia and the United States in Central Asia.
This is the Voice of Russia, broadcasting from the heart of London. From Monday to Friday, we're live here on digital from 4 p.m. until 8. We're also online at ruvr.co.uk. Tune in for current affairs, news, arts and debate.
You're listening to Voice of Russia's political program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Jonathan Steele, do you want to reflect upon that? Because Demon brings up a very good point, is that Afghanistan is an issue that brings both countries together, but once those troops are out, there's no... There's
once
no
the
link.
majority of troops out,
yeah, the
Russia
majority
disagrees with some.
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, Dimitris
link.
elaborated on the point I was trying to make, that Russians are more concerned about the future of Afghanistan than Americans are. After all, Russia is close to Afghanistan. America is thousands and thousands of miles away. I think they've given up. Actually, Europe is more concerned because most of the drugs that come through from Afghanistan, the heroin and so on, is consumed in Russia or in Europe, but not in the United States. So I think the Americans are basically turning their back on Afghanistan. All they're trying to do is to avoid the impression of defeat and leave with some sort of honor and in good order, and then they're just going to forget about it. It has very little strategic value.
I don't think America is less concerned with Afghanistan, but in a totally different way. David Kilcullen, who was Petraeus' assistant, the Australian who created the surge, said to me, and he said in front of, in fact, Chatham House, that the Taliban were already running Afghanistan. He said this about 8 years ago. There were about 20 civic governments. They weren't putting their fingers up girls cutting off arms. They were actually running civic government. This was not being faced by the Americans. They're still not being faced by the Americans now. He was actually fired shortly after saying this. And he said to me that when he lay awake at night, his nightmare was Pakistan. The Americans are not concerned of Afghanistan. They're concerned about Pakistan. And they consider Pakistan to be linked to Afghanistan in ways that they can't handle. This is a really complicated piece. And, you know, the great grandmasters in chess are the Russians. So I would have thought they would have seen the importance not only of worrying about the drug traffic on their own border and their own Islamic problem internally, which nobody's mentioned yet, which is a huge factor in all of this, but I think we ought to be concerned about where Pakistan's going to go with their 100 nuclear warheads and a very, very confused sort of government, and Iran opposed to the Taliban. How is this all going to emerge? How are the Russians going to deal with their part of the Pakistan problem?
You know, Dima, that's an excellent point that James brought up here, is that if we look at the big bone of contention, Syria, it's how it's reported in Western media, Russia's morally wrong, it supports a dictator, it doesn't support the Syrian people. I can go through all of these things here. But as James just said, I mean, we look at Syria all the way to Pakistan, that's pretty close to Russia, and Russia has a large Muslim minority as well. Really disappointed that even policymakers don't come out and say, well, geez, the Russians are pretty concerned because it's their neighborhood. It's really close by. And we did have this awful tragedy in Chechnya. A lot of people not remembering that in the last decade.
This is exactly why Russia is very much concerned about irresponsibility of American policy, because they are leaving Afghanistan or semi-leaving Afghanistan with leaving total mess behind. They are explicitly saying that now you, Russia, and you, China, are going to deal with that. But they invite us in dealing with that only after they leave. Why do not establish a dialogue already now, before they leave? And
the
let's
domestic
discuss
problem
the future of Afghanistan in a trilateral way or multilateral way, not on January 1, 2015.
Doing that, as it was mentioned a few minutes ago, that would be the Americans admitting total, utter defeat in a country
Absolutely.
that they never should have invaded.
Well,
in the first place.
fact that
James, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, the fact that they're exiting at this point is an admission of that defeat. The fact that Obama was elected is an admission of that defeat. We lost the Korean War. We lost the Vietnam War. Our military is in a state of total humiliation. And I think one of the factors in all this is that Obama's had to deal with is backing out of there in a way that preserves some kind of dignity for our armed forces. I mean, I don't really particularly care personally about that, but I think it's a huge factor in America and not an unworthy one. I mean, the defeat is there. And, we are getting out. And that was part of his mandate when he was elected. I think Russia and China has to see that we are not going to support that. And we're supporting copper operations the Chinese are running in Afghanistan. They have no military there, and neither do the Russians. We can't go on supporting Afghanistan single-handedly. If the Russians want something different to happen there, I think the Russians and the Chinese can get there and propose a way of dealing with that, which is tripartite. I totally agree with you. But it can't be based on the idea America's got to stay there and behave the way Russia perhaps would like us Assad to continue behaving. I mean, that can't happen there. The Taliban will take over. So, I mean, that is a fait accompli, and I've heard many French experts who know that area very well say that they're only legitimate power in Afghanistan. I mean, they're not wonderfully lovable, but, they're going to be there. So we're going to get the Taliban. How do we deal with that? That's where the tripart discussion happens, not keeping America in there.
Okay, gentlemen, I want to ask each one of you a quick question because we're almost running out of time. Jonathan, I'd like to go to you. What could Russia do and what can the United States/West do to make Russian-Western American relations better on both sides?
Well, first of all, improve the language. Just talk normally, accept differences, and be polite and respectful as one should be with all countries around the world. That's the first thing. Then to look at the agenda of current agenda and try and work out ways in which they could help. And the first one, of course, is Syria. They could really get going on Syria and push that Geneva conference, push everybody to attend, and try and find a compromise. Thank you.
James?
A very small thing that hasn't been mentioned is the Magnitsky case. And I mean, I met Browder's grandson, who is causing so much trouble. I was ashamed to see the Congress getting involved in this way. I mean, I can imagine Russians being very annoyed about it. I think there should be more dialogue on a cultural level. I can't believe that the new Russia can't speak in a new Russia way to America and vice versa. I mean, the failures of post-Glasnost that I mentioned earlier are still factoring into this. Russia doesn't look comfortably democratized. They're not speaking as a democratic power to America in that kind of environment. And it allows an awful lot of misunderstanding to arise. I mean, I thought that Magnitsky case was a disgrace, and I completely agree with Putin in being annoyed by it. But I mean, there's so much incomprehension. I mean, and that stuff really is Cold War disaffection and fecklessness. And we really have to raise the con, get rid of the Cold War once and for all.
That's a very good point, James, and I'd like to address Dima here. I'll give you almost the last word here. I agree with a lot of what James just said, is that I've lived here for 15 years, and I've seen how Russian officialdom speaks to the outside world. Yeah. And it's awkward, quite often awkward, okay? Or it doesn't like being asked questions. In Western governments, I mean, like them or hate them, Obama has to take a lot of heat. Cameron has to take a lot of heat. They have to take questions. Here, people are less comfortable. Leaderships are less comfortable with being asked questions here. So it's more of a rhetorical approach at times.
Yeah, that's a problem. But the problem lies not only with Russia. Of course, Russia could change the tone. Russia should change the way it speaks with the outside world. I totally agree. Russia should avoid the additional politicization of its relations with the West, because now, obviously, relations with the United States are used as a mechanism of the Russian domestic politics, of marginalizing opposition and so on and so forth. This should be avoided. But at the same time, the United States, I think, should eventually accommodate to the fact that they are not almighty, that they are not global hegemons anymore, that it is normal thing that there are some countries who do not want to absorb the American agenda as it is, but propose some alterations to this agenda. So the United States should accommodate to the fact that it should just, talk to the others and elaborate a joint agenda. So and this will bring solution to Syria, solution to Afghanistan.
I'll sum it up for you. A multipolar world.
Yeah, and maybe last word. I mean, let me come back to where you started. Arms control. It was a very bad mistake to start a reset with arms control, because it strengthens rather than reduces the strategic deterrence philosophy in the U.S.-Russia relations. But it is even a greater mistake to start the new phase of the U.S.-Russia relations now from arms control again. And unfortunately, this is what the United States is doing. Again, for unilateral American purposes. To fulfill
it's a topic for another program. Jonathan, James, and Dima here with me in Moscow. I want to thank you for being guests on Debating Russia here on Voice of Russia. Stay with us.